opens a crucial diagonal for the queen, immediately challenging central influence and creating dynamic possibilities. Opens up the queen's diagonal, preparing a solid pawn structure and potential kingside pressure. This unassuming pawn advance preps a fianchetto, aiming for a more flexible kingside development. Developing the knight to its natural square, now prepares castling and applies pressure to the center. Developing the bishop to this diagonal creates immediate pressure along the long diagonal, aiming towards black's kingside. Black immediately contests the center, aiming to disrupt white's kingside fianchetto and open up diagonals. Solidifying central influence, this knight prepares for potential queenside expansion or a central pawn break. Instantly contesting the center with c5 solidifies black's queenside space and prepares a potential fianchetto of the bishop. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount. The castling move secures the king and activates the rook, preparing for future central action. Boldly seizing central territory, black now dictates the pawn structure, creating immediate tension and restricting white's king's side development. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing development, this move gracefully concedes central space for future counterplay. Asserting central presence, this knight now eyes the d2 square, challenging white's kingside fianchetto structure. Cracking open the center like this sacrifices space for queenside development potential. Capturing on d4 reestablishes equality, opening lines and challenging white's central pawn structure. Initiating a pawn chain that subtly aims to control central squares, while inviting potential tactical interplay. Aiding kingside defense, the bishop now finds a solid outpost, preparing to contest the central e4 square's influence. Developing the knight to the rim like this forfeits valuable central influence, potentially allowing black to consolidate their pawn mass and control key squares with ease. Securing the king now frees the bishop and prepares for potential central pawn pushes. Shifting the knight from the edge, aiming for central influence and preparing potential queenside expansion. Launching a queenside pawn push like this aims to disrupt white's space advantage and potentially open lines for counterplay. Unlocking the e file offers a pathway for your rook to join the central skirmish and potentially apply pressure. Preparing the e-file for potential action, the rook now anchors its position to support central pawn pushes and potentially contest open files later. Fortifying the queenside pawn structure, this move curbs black's central aspirations and prepares a potential queenside expansion. Repositioning the bishop to f8 shores up the kingside's defensive structure and prepares to eye the long diagonal should the center open. Unleashing the knight towards the enemy king's flank, this maneuver seeks to exploit potential weaknesses in black's queenside pawn structure. Simplifying the pawn structure, black resolves the tension and aims for a more open game. Reclaiming the open file with the rook immediately pressures black's uncastled king and strengthens white's central control. Reclaiming the e-file and preparing a daring knight sortie towards the kingside offers a dynamic counterpoint. Asserting pressure on the queen side, this rook maneuvers to a more active outpost, potentially harassing black's structure. The knight vacates its post, creating potential for pawn advances and repositioning for a central foothold. Seizing the open file with the bishop, white aims to disrupt black's coordination and create attacking chances along the file. Securing the queen's placement allows for potential pressure along the 7th rank and bolsters central influence. Securing the central outpost with the knight creates immediate pressure and limits black's piece mobility. The rook retreats, preserving its activity while preventing the bishop from becoming a positional liability on a3. Sacrificing the rook opens up critical lines, offering counterplay against black's potentially exposed king. A bold recapture, sacrificing central influence for a clearer diagonal for the bishop. Unleashing a knight to the queen side, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit the exposed dark squares. Black seeks to untangle the queen side by initiating a pawn exchange and activating the queen. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal pressure clears lines for white's pieces, aiming to exploit black's slightly exposed king. Recapturing the pawn opens a pathway for your queen, though it now sits somewhat exposed. Solidifying central control, this pawn advance aims to open lines and build a formidable pawn chain for future pressure. Reclaiming the central tension, black eyes the open d-file and prepares to reactivate the light-squared bishop. Opening the c-file decisively, white aims to exploit the d4 pawn and create immediate queenside pressure. Bringing the rook to the open file to contest it is a logical reaction, aiming to disrupt white's central control and create counterplay. Seeking to activate the queen and support the advanced pawn, this maneuver also aims to control the open files. Controlling the critical c5 square and preparing to challenge white's pawn chain is a sensible aim. Asserting central dominion, the queen eyes the weakened kingside for potential disruption. Unlocking diagonals, black ignites counterplay against white's pawn weaknesses while preparing to activate the rook. A potent knight sacrifice aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and open critical lines for your queen. A necessary retreat to prevent material loss, though it sacrifices kingside initiative for passive defense. Unleashing potential on the kingside, this pawn push seeks to dislodge black's queenside presence and open attacking avenues. Defending the pawn structure with a humble pawn provides solidifying prophylaxis against immediate pressure. Shifting the rook aims to establish control over the central files, potentially pressuring black's king. Fortifying the kingside and preparing a potential pawn push, this move aims to stabilize black's position. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to pry open lines for attack. Unleashing a pawn shield, the black king seeks refuge, potentially at the cost of the central outpost. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside, this gambit sacrifices material for aggressive counterplay against black's somewhat cramped position. Opening the king's position risks creating immediate weaknesses around the monarch. Sacrificing pawn structure opens files, potentially creating decisive attacking avenues for your monarch. Sacrificing the pawn opens up the b-file, creating dynamic counterplay against white's potentially exposed king. Opening the queenside to exploit weaknesses and create threats against the exposed king. Unlocking the b-file, this rook's repositioning initiates a fascinating counterplay, challenging white's central control and seeking active piece coordination. Seizing the open file opens a direct assault on black's weakened queenside pawn structure. Recapturing the queen immediately resolves the immediate tactical threat and simplifies the position, offering a more manageable endgame. Unlocking the d-file for the rook after the queen's sacrifice dramatically alters the endgame landscape. Regaining a pawn, black introduces a crucial imbalance into the material count. Unlocking the h-file opens new tactical avenues against the isolated pawns. Reclaiming the pawn reestablishes piece mobility, eyeing the open h-file as a potential invasion route. Pawn advances begin to cleave open the position, aiming to exploit the newly opened file and pressure black's isolated kingside. Reclaiming the d-file opens crucial attacking avenues, and white must be wary of the pawn's advance.